colonization. For countries that suffered from it, colonization was a painful time and also a reminder why they decided to be independent in the first place. From slavery, erasure of identity, looting of resources, and other bad things that happened. At the same time, colonization didn't just bring only sorrow, but also a change for the enslaved nation. Some of them are considered as a positive change, like introduction of technology, which most people agree is a positive change, until changes like introduction of new religion and new culture, which some consider good, while others disagree. About culture, one aspect of culture that is openly visible is language. Even when the colonizer had left, it has still been used until now. That's why English is an international language, and French is an official language for many African countries. Even if they don't adopt it as an official language, it is still widely used, like in the case of English in Malaysia or the French in Algeria. However, it's not the case for Indonesia. Despite being colonized by the Dutch for a long time, and also Indonesian language has many vocabularies from Dutch, Dutch isn't spoken widely in Indonesia. Forget the idea about Dutch as Indonesia's official language. The number of speakers and interest from Indonesians to learn Dutch is quite small compared to English or Arabic. I even think most Indonesians would have more interest in learning Korean or Japanese. So there's a question, how did this happen? How did a country who had the same colonizer for a very long time but doesn't speak the colonizer's language? Let me explain. The first factor is from the Dutch. When Europeans colonize a territory that has been settled by the native, usually we think either they forced them into slaves or even a genocide. But in many instances, they didn't always choose a violent way in terms of treatment of the native. At the time, many Europeans believed they were the best group in the world. So many Europeans believed they had some kind of duty to civilize the native, like introducing Christianity, teaching them the Western manners, and of course the language. But this didn't apply to the Dutch because they only focused on the economic aspect. As long as they could gain something from locals, the civilizing mission wasn't needed at all. This also explains why in the 17th century, when the Japanese forbade Europeans to trade in Japan, the Dutch were the exception because in case of Japan, the Dutch didn't have an interest in spreading religion in Japan. In the case of language, while other Europeans forced the native to learn their language, the Dutch tended to use the local language. For Indonesia, or should I say the Dutch is Indies, it's the Malay language. Why? The Malay language was the one that unified the Indonesian archipelago. I need to remind you that Indonesia as a nation right now didn't exist in that time. The Indonesian archipelago consisted of kingdoms. If each kingdom wanted to do some trade or diplomatic mission, the Malay language was the choice to communicate. It didn't mean that there were no native learning the Dutch language. However, the numbers were quite small and most of them were from royalty background. The realization from the Dutch to teach the language started to appear in the late 19th century. The Dutch introduced ethische politiek or ethical politics in English, which one of the programs was education, but it was too late. Malay has become a dominant language among natives in Indonesia. Also, education programs didn't mean the Dutch language will be taught. First, not all schools used Dutch during the learning even though many of them were built by the Dutch. Second, the Dutch were reluctant to teach language in the East Indies. I found two reasons why. First, the Dutch were afraid that if a lot of natives knew Dutch, it would be dangerous because many of them would read or understand something that might threaten the hegemony in the East Indies. Second, the Dutch considered native or Indonesian, especially those who weren't from the royals, as someone lower than them, or should I say the lowest case in the colony. So the idea that natives speak their language is considered mockery for the Dutch as the highest case in the East Indies. The second factor is nationalist movement. So on the day the Dutch decided to colonize the archipelago, there were different reactions among natives. Some cooperated with the Dutch, while at the same time, many didn't want to submit to the Dutch. Wars and rebellions rose for centuries, but the Dutch always won the fight, even though the Dutch were quite small in terms of number of the troops. The Dutch were more superior in weaponry. Also, the natives always just fought for their own group or region, and sometimes there was a fight among them, which means it was easier for the Dutch to destroy it because there was no unity. Entering the 20th century, there was a shift in the struggle for independence. Instead of fighting for their own region, natives across regions start to unite. Why did the shift happen? In the early 20th century, Indonesians that had a privilege to attend higher education realized that to gain independence, they couldn't do the same old way. They also realized that the whole of colonization was felt by many natives across the colony, so they decided to unite. Even though each region is different, as long as it has the same enemy, it's better to be together. The word Indonesia is used as an identity for the native. The struggle for unity and independence was manifested in 28 October 1928, when youths across Indonesia made a pledge to unite in a congress in Jakarta. The manifest is called Sumpah Pemuda, or the Youth Pledge in English. It contains 3 pledges. For this video, we will focus on the third one, which in English it reads, "We, sons and daughters of Indonesia, who uphold the language of unity, the Indonesian language." The Indonesian language has become a national identity and a symbol of resistance. As I told you before, since Malay language was a common language in the archipelago, the Indonesian language is rooted from the Malay language instead of Javanese. Although the majority of natives in Indonesia are Javanese, the Indonesian language is also one of the uniting factors in Indonesia because there are thousands of languages spoken in Indonesia. The Dutch saw the Indonesian language as a threat. The Dutch tried to suppress it and also tried to promote their language. On the other hand, Indonesian hadn't become a common language among our native. Many Indonesians still knew and spoke Dutch. The situation changed in 1942. Third factor is Japan. On 8 March 1942, the Dutch surrendered and gave the Dutch East Indies to Japan. Japan has 2 purposes for why they wanted to conquer the Dutch East Indies in the first place. First was about resources, especially oil for war utility. Second was about the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In summary, Japan wanted to build its own hegemony in Asia, especially East and Southeast Asia. To strengthen the power, Japan banned or forbade anything related to the Western culture, especially in Southeast Asia, which was colonized by the West at that time. Also, Japan tried to force its cultures on the conquered nations as a way to connect the colonies with Japan. In the case of Indonesia, the Dutch language was banned. Japanese language teachers were sent there to teach the Indonesian Japanese, and Indonesian language was allowed to be used in public, which raises a question: why Japan allowed it instead of forcing the Indonesian to use Japanese? It's because the Indonesian language could be used as propaganda. An effective way to convince Indonesians to join Japan's agenda is to reach them with something the common Indonesian knows, which means Japanese couldn't be used because most Indonesians didn't understand Japanese. So Indonesian was chosen for the propaganda. With purpose or not, language policy by Japan has built a foundation for Indonesia in the future. Since Dutch was banned and Indonesian language was allowed and even widely spread, the Indonesian language has rooted in society while Dutch has faded away. And for icing on the cake, here's the fourth factor. After 3 years under Japanese occupation, Indonesia declared their independence. The Dutch didn't accept that, so a war happened and lasted for 4 years. Indonesia won the war and the Dutch beat their nails. The animosity didn't end in 1949. In the 1950s, both countries' relations soured due to the issue of West New Guinea. Sukarno, who was president at that time, was quite angry because Indonesia still couldn't get the West New Guinea. So he enacted policies which basically anything that related to the Dutch needed to go. It ranged from nationalization of companies that owned by the Dutch until the expulsion of Dutch descent from Indonesia. The Dutch language in Indonesia definitely wouldn't grow with that political condition. Even after relations between Indonesia and the Netherlands have gotten better, the Dutch language has a quite tough road to gain popularity in Indonesia. Let's compare it to other languages. English is definitely popular because it's an international language and also a mandatory lesson in Indonesian school. Arabic is popular because Islam is a majority religion in Indonesia. Mandarin is popular because many Chinese descendants live in Indonesia, and also the current rise of China means Mandarin is probably needed in the future. Korean and Japanese gain popularity due to their entertainment export like K-pop and anime. About Dutch, it's gained less popularity due to the fact it's not an international language. Netherlands is a quite dominant force in international politics like US or China. Small number of Dutch descent population in Indonesia. Lack of influence from modern culture like South Korea or Japan. Doesn't have a connection with religion like Arabic with Islam. And history. Before I end this video, I will explain something that some of you might ask. Does the Dutch language have a future in Indonesia right now? In my opinion, yes. First, if you study history or law in Indonesian university, you will study Dutch. For history, many archives about Indonesia are in Dutch, while for law, since many Indonesian laws are based on colonial law, so Dutch is needed for study. Some other Indonesians can speak Dutch, but usually it's from those who had a chance to get a better education in the past. Also, there is an effort to preserve the Dutch language by establishing Dutch learning centers, in which many of them have cooperated with learning institutions in the Netherlands or Belgium. Well, that's my explanation. You can like, comment, or share this video if you found it good. Peace.